Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good evening, everyone. I know most of you, but let me introduce myself. My name is Charles Stang. I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. And it is my great honor and privilege to welcome you to this evening's program, which is on sacred plant medicines and indigenous communities. It's a symposium where we are featuring two of the center's postdoctoral fellows, one of our postdoctoral fellows in psychedelics and spirituality, and our other fellow in indigenous plant medicine traditions of the Americas. But before we dive into this symposium and I introduce our speakers, I want to thank the CSWR staff, and I want to thank our colleagues who help with AV. And Robbie, is Robbie still here? No, Robbie left. Okay, well, thank you, Robbie, and thank you for helping us out as well. This is especially acute today because we have some complicated PowerPoints that you'll soon enjoy. And Osiris, unfortunately, will be can't join us in person and will be joining through Zoom. So we have some complicated technological realities to navigate, and I just want to thank you all in advance for your patience as we navigate that. If there are any glitches, we'll try to resolve them as quickly as possible. And please keep our intrepid AV colleagues in mind and heart as they try to navigate these challenges. So, now on to this evening's program. Indigenous communities worldwide have held knowledge of sacred plants for thousands of years. And far from monolithic, these communities have very diverse theologies, ritual practices, and community approaches to these sacred plants. Moreover, indigenous communities are evolving with globalization and representing critical perspectives in the contemporary understandings of plants, fungi, and substances that are often referred to today as psychedelic. For the past year, the center has been fortunate to have two postdoctoral fellows, Osiris González Romero and Andrea Sánchez-Castañeda. How'd I do on that? I got a coach on that. Working at the forefront of psychedelics and spirituality and indigenous plant medicine traditions of the Americas. So this evening is a capstone event in which Andrea will share her research on sacred plant medicines of the Muysca of Suba, an urban indigenous community in Bogotá, Colombia. And we're very, very honored to have two collaborators from that community joining us this evening. I'll say more about them in a moment. And following Andrea and her collaborators' presentation, Osiris will join us, as I said, via Zoom, and he will be sharing his findings drawn on his research on indigenous medicine and psilocybin mushroom rituals in Mesoamerica. And Rebecca Mendoza, a PhD candidate in Harvard's Committee on the Study of Religion, will respond to their presentations, and then, if time allows, I will moderate a discussion and Q&A from the audience. So allow me to give slightly more robust introductions. Andrea Sánchez-Castañeda, I don't think I got it that time, is a cultural anthropologist in critical indigenous and urban environmental studies in Latin America. Her research focuses on the ontological dimensions of indigeneity, territory, nature, and the sacred of the Muysca of Suba in Bogotá, Colombia, with whom she has collaborated for over 8 years. Andrea earned her PhD in Global and Sociocultural Studies and her MA in Religious Studies from Florida International University, where she was a member of the Global Indigenous Forum. Here at the center, Andrea has been collaborating with the Muysca community to document the use of sacred plant medicines and their vital role in indigenous revitalization and territorial defense in Bogotá. And we are especially pleased and privileged and honored to welcome Nicole Torres and Camila Yopasa from the Muysca community, whom Andrea will give a proper introduction to momentarily. Osiris González Romero holds a BA in philosophy from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, or UNAM, and an MA in humanities from the Universidad Autónoma, thank you, forgive me, there's a much harder word coming, Metropolitana, from the UAM. And here he holds a PhD in philosophy from Leiden University. I know how to pronounce that. Now, Osiris also makes me try to pronounce this word regularly. His doctoral dissertation is entitled, bear with me now, Tlama Tilitzli. Thank you. Thank you for all your patience with that. And that is, the subtitle of that is The Wisdom of the Nahua People, Intercultural Philosophy and Land Rights. Thank you all for correcting me so graciously. And that dissertation is published by Leiden University Press. I actually do know some other languages. I just don't know Mesoamerican pronunciation, so forgive me, okay? I'm not bad in some other languages. Osiris did postdoctoral stays at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, where their pronunciation is as bad as mine, and at the Institute of Philosophical Investigations. In 2015, he received the Coimbra Group Scholarship for Young Professors and Researchers from Latin American Universities, and he was a research associate from the, with the Philosophy and Psychedelics Research Group at the University of Exeter in the UK. And finally, Rebecca Mendoza joins us as a respondent. As I mentioned, she is a PhD candidate in Harvard's Committee on the Study of Religion, where her research focuses on Mesoamerican and indigenous plant medicine traditions. So thank you all so much. I believe the order is Andrea and Nicole and Camila, and then we will invite Osiris and finally Rebecca. Thank you all once again, and welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here to join us at the opening act. And first, I have to say thank you so much to Charles, Gosha, Paul, and Jeff for believing in this project a year ago. And also, okay, do you hear me well? Better, okay, perfect. And the staff here at the center, because I know the amount of work that they have this week, so thank you so much. So today we're gonna be presenting, and for those that join us in the last Psychedelic Intersection Conference, some of the themes are gonna pop up today as well, but we actually wanna focus on some reflections that have emerged in the process of this project. So that's where we wanna focus today our attention. So before I start, I would like to introduce my colleagues, my collaborators, and who have opened their territory and their hearts to me as a researcher. So first, Nicole Torres, she is an indigenous Muysca woman from the territory of Suba. She's a member of the Niviayo Caviativa clan. She holds a degree in Spanish languages from the National Pedagogical University in Colombia. She has specialized training in the Muysca language, and she holds a master's. She's graduating a few months from now in linguistics at the National University in Colombia, where she's currently also serving as a professor. She was hired as a professor at the university to teach the Muysca language, which is currently under revitalization in the community. Nicole is my main collaborator in this project, and she's an on-site collaborator, and they within the project we call it Enlace Territorial, or Territorial Link, and she's also a co-investigator in this project. And today also we have join us Camila Yopasa. She's an indigenous Muysca woman from the ancestral territory of Suba. She's a member of the Yopasa Niviayo clan. She's a graphic designer who graduated from Santo Tomas University with a strong experience in community communication, intercultural design, and revitalization of ancestral knowledge. Her work focuses on strengthening identity to visual culture, photography, audiovisual media, and indigenous education. She joined us in a sub-project within the main project of the Photo Voice project that I'm going to be talking later. She's also currently a Muysca authority. She's part of the Indigenous Council government, and she's the leader of the communication group. So, okay, I hope we follow this outline for today's presentation. So first, we're gonna give a brief background of the history of the community, so we all are in the same page. Followed by a little bit of how is that this project emerged within the whole process of research, which is using participatory action research as main methodology, the methods we have conducted so far. And we're gonna jump on to the core of the presentation, which is Muysca plant medicine and the findings that we have discovered during this project, and some reflections that we all gonna give from our own experience within this project. And we're gonna finish with some words from the governor of the Muysca community. He unfortunately he couldn't join us today, but he's sending some words about the current territorial claim of a sacred mountain in Colombia. So let's start. So Camila is gonna start with a brief background.
Choa. The Muyscas people are the original people of Bogotá, Colombia. During the Spanish colonization, with the Muysca lived in cities like Bogotá and Tunja until the mestizo population became dominant. The establishment of pueblos de indios, Indian towns, forts, labor in encomiendas, epidemics, the suppression of indigenous belief, and the introduction of livestock in 1542 greatly transformed the Muysca landscape and economy. These events impose a colonial mindset that altered our social organization and disrupted our connection with the land. In the 19th century, during the Republic period, the privatization of resguardos, indigenous reservation, led to the removal of the Muysca's legal indigenous status. This resulted in land dispossession and the erosion of our native identity. However, the revival of Muysca identity in the 20th century marked by the creation of the Cabildo Indígena Muysca of Suba in 1991, represent a reconnection with memory and territory. This resurgence changed centuries of exclusion and land exploitation, calling for a reassessment of historical narratives. For us, the Muysca of Suba treats like urbanization, deforestation, and water contamination endanger our sacred sites. Through cultural revitalization project, the Cabildo Indígena Muysca of Suba works to restore ancestral traditional in cuisines, language, weaving, music, agriculture, and medicine, preserving Muysca heritage and empower our sense of belonging and resistance in our native land, Bogotá.
I must say that they have done a lot of practice and they are doing so much good. So good, Camila. You should be proud of yourself. Okay, so this project emerged. So I started working with the community when I was conducting my master thesis. But then when I started working on my dissertation project, I realized that I had to change the methodology that I was using because this is the way that we should be working with indigenous peoples. So I'm using participatory action research as the main methodology. This methodology emerges from the Colombian sociologist Orlando Falsborda in the 50s. And for him, participation is this breakup between the researcher and the research. Is completely this negation of this idea of this asymmetry between the communities and the researcher. And what it really matter for me using this methodology is the practical part of this methodology. So the researcher is not only conducting research for the sake of academic recognition and success, but it also has to have some kind of impact, and this is how this project emerged. So we're going to talk about more about the issue with the Sacred Mountain in Colombia, but this project emerged as a way to support the legal claim for this mountain, because the Colombian state was asking for some kind of anthropological background of why is that this mountain matter for the community. So as I mentioned, this project emerged as a need to support the Muysca territorial claims of the santuario. And this paper, as all the project emerged as an ongoing collaborative research project that has been done all the process with Nicole. She has conducted, along with me, multiple interviews with shaitas, which are medicine men and women from the community, as well as we're gonna be doing with the work with some elders during this summer. And we created the first Sacred Medicine Photo Voice project, and that's where Camila started working with us in collaboration with the community's communication group. This visual methodology of photo voice, why is important? Because it's the community who's portraying themselves. It's not just a researcher gaze, but it's also a community portraying and bringing self-representations of the relationship between the community, plants, and the territory of Suba.
So we would like to share with you the revitalization of Muysca plant medicine. The community of Suba has developed multiple initiatives around cultural revitalization as a fundamental axis for our survival within our 50 Plan de Vida or life plan. Cultural revitalization, understood as a set of pedagogical and research actions, has materialized in various projects, especially in the recovering knowledge related to traditional medicine and agriculture. In this process, the use of medicinal and sacred plants occupies a central place, not only as part of the healing practice, but also as an intrinsic element of the spiritual and cultural relationship we have with the territory. The revitalization of plant medicine does not simply aim to rescue past practices, but also to make visible those practices that, although hidden, remain alive in the community. These practices are preserved in the memory and everyday of the elders, who, despite the territorial and cultural transformation of Suba, continue to defend their knowledge against Western biomedicine. An example of this is the ontological relationship between the Muysca and plants, which manifests the community's understanding of plants as living beings with spirit, requiring care and respect. In this worldview, interacting with plants involves specific rituals, such as avoiding them during menstruation, seeking permission before harvesting, handling them gently, and maintaining communication during watering or ritual use. Preparing remedies like infusions, oils, poultices, or syrups requires not just knowledge of their properties, but also spiritual connection, where healers, traditional doctors, or apprentices ask the plant's permission to ensure its effectiveness. Another key dimension of the revitalization of sacred plant medicine lies in agriculture, a practice that has undergone drastic transformation over more than 480 years of colonization in our land. The arrival of the city altered agricultural dynamics, displacing traditional gardens that, in many cases, were sold due to rising land taxes and urban expansions. Despite the loss of cultivable land, the community has found forms of resistance through urban agriculture. In this context, for example, Chaita and Elder Ignacio Musuzu Neuque emphasize the importance of gardens and sources of self-sustenance for the community. He said, "The gardens in the territory are important because here we use many plants and we have to buy them, and we have to buy them and bring them from other territories. but we can plant them here ourselves. These seeds and plants will grow with the intention of the Muysca territory. Far from being a knowledge learned from external models, these practices emerge as a response to the imposition of the city. In courtyards, rooftops, and from gardens, especially the Muysca grandmothers have passed down the land and seeds from generation to generation. Now cultivating them in flower pots, old pots, barrels, buckets, and other recycled containers. Paradoxically, the waste generated by urbanization and modernity has been transformed into tools of survival, allowing medicinal plants and some edible species to not disappear on the concrete, but to continue resisting in the domestic spaces of the community. In these containers, the indigenous grandmothers have preserved the botanical memory of our territory, ensuring that sacred plants remain alive in our lands.
Okay, so the traditional use of tobacco and its derivatives, which are ambira, which is a wax made out of tobacco, which is cooked for several hours or days, hosca and rapé, which are snuff, as well as coca in both leaf and as mambe, along with teque, I hope I'm saying it right, which is the brugmansia tree, and other medicinal plants have been vital component of the Muysca revitalization process and the strengthening of political efforts aimed at defending and reclaiming the city. So both during our interviews, the shaitas, the medicine men and women, and also the elders, they divided the plants into two categories. So some of them are the plants of power, plantas de poder, which are these spiritual strong plants, including tobacco and teque, which is the brugmansia tree, and the others, which are the everyday plants, as I mentioned before. They're both are revered. That's the word. Yeah, revered, and these are considered living entities with spirit and agency, working alongside the chaitas to either harmonize people or spaces, or to open and share the word. An act that involves opening a space to share knowledge, initiate an important conversation, or bring messages. Something similar to what we experienced this afternoon. For instance, Elder Ignacio described how his community prepared spiritually for the visit of government officials by using tobacco as a sacred messenger to invite spiritual support. During the ceremony, he was smoking the tobacco and he had a vision of an elder reading a big book in the santuario, which he interpreted as a sign that the political meeting will bring good news. This highlights the integration of a spiritual practice with political and environmental engagement in indigenous communities. Other spiritual plants, such as coca in the form of mambe, have been revitalized as a medicinal plant within the community, and it is widely used. For the medicine man, Jason Jopasao, which you can see in the video, mambe serves as a vessel of intergenerational knowledge that revitalizes the essence of the Muysca people. By using mambe, the Muysca healer embodies the plant's personhood. But most importantly, the healers are infused with the knowledge of their ancestors about the territory. He states, the mambe carries the wisdom of the elders who have walked the territory. So we make medicine to find the spirit, the words of the elders, and the feeling of Mother Earth herself. This medicine awakes in us the knowledge that exists and is stored within. The same way, Chaita Miriam, which also serves as a midwife within the community, also signal how other plants of power from other territories allow her to awake the knowledge of the Muysca medicine. Because I forgot to mention, this community was considered indigenous, and then with the loss of the Republican period in the 19th century, they were assimilated into the peasant, and they were recategorized as peasants. But this was an imposition made by the state. It was not a self-interpretation of their own identity. So, and within the 1990s, they were recognized again as an indigenous community from Colombia. But she mentioned in our interview that she had to use jopo and yahe from other territories. These are not native plants from the Bogotá region. But she had to use those medicines to awake the knowledge that it was stored within. Both of the Chaitas and the elders that we spoke with during this project affirm that plants of power are reserved exclusively for the use of the medicine man or the woman. These plants are used to prepare themselves before assisting patients, to harmonize communal gatherings or rituals, or in a specific or rare cases, these are shared with patients, community members, or outsiders seeking medical assistance. They emphasize how the experience of being caminantes de la medicina, or medicine walkers, was shaped by the transmission of knowledge from their grandparents or other healers. So they highlight the importance of lineage and preservation of knowledge. And this is something that we continue to work on currently, and is the use of these everyday medicinal plants, which we have some kind of doing an inventory of these plants, and they mention, for instance, stinging nettle, calendula, rosemary, elderflower, arboloco, arrayan, and cedro nogal, among others. These plants are combined with other plants of power when they are cooking, for instance, the ambira, which is the tobacco-based wax. And even though something that also has been very interesting is that even though some of these plants were brought by the process of colonization, these are now considered part of the community as well. So, as part of our reflections, we didn't like the word conclusions because this is an ongoing process, and we continue to do this project, and also because there's no conclusion when you're working with indigenous plant medicine. So what we have found is that this project has demonstrated that sacred indigenous plant is also present in the urban landscape. And while technologies of dispossession, such as urbanization, displacement, make increasingly difficult for communities to cultivate their own plants because they don't have land to cultivate, they are finding ways to keep reclaiming urban spaces and establishing other forms of alternative urban agriculture. Also, by revitalizing Muysca medicine and plant knowledge, the Chaitas and the elders maintain a profound connection to this territory, which includes not only the non-human plants, but also animals, fungi, minerals, and also the spiritual worlds. By resisting the urban development of these plants, the Muysca contribute to the protection of ecosystems that are crucial for the survival and the endangered species of fauna and flora in the city.
Communication have emerged as vital tools for our community through community-based media, multimedia, and now digital platforms. We have found a space not only to dialogue, sorry, but also to strengthen our identity, defend our rights, and foremost, capture our collective memory. Communication have allowed us to record the voices of our Chaitas, capture stories about sacred plants, documents healing rituals, and share the narrative that explain our worldviews and the use of our medicine, always with the respect and permission of our elders. This process is not merely technical, it is a profound act of resistance to tell other peoples that the Muyscas are still here, healing in our territory through ancestral knowledge. For us, communication are the thread that weaves together the past and the future, strengthening our autonomy, our well-being, and a path to ensure that the knowledge of our elders is not lost, but continues to flourish.
On the other hand, we hope this work inspires ethical and collaborative research with indigenous communities rather than about or without, to gather, preserve, and produce knowledge that not only highlights the complexity of plant medicine, but also addresses the political, cultural, and territorial needs of these our communities. Also, we hope to democratize the access to these types of reflections and projects in community-based spaces, rather than in only academic centers, to show the value of this and knowledge within communities so that these are aware of the impact of these practices and knowledge. And finally, we hope challenge how scholars across various disciplines portray indigenous people's knowledge and practices as exotic, while expecting overly simplistic version of indigeneity that fail to reflect the lived experiences of indigenous peoples and communities.
Okay, and finally, so we would like to situate this process in the sacred mountain of del Santuario. Our last reflection we would like to share tonight is that to ensure that these plants have an ecosystem to inhabit, we must understand that humans cannot maintain our cultural practices without a natural environment to support them. These plants that have survived for millennia have seen their habitats disappear due to urbanization. This not only endangers biodiversity, but also their ancestral traditions and knowledges. And this is why we would like to invite you to reflect on this issue through the words of our governor, who we're going to present right now, who has defended the conservation of this territory since 2018, when they occupied the mountain, and recognizing that protecting these spaces is key to preserving their culture and maintaining balance with nature. So, do we have a few minutes, please?
Aquí en el Cerro Santuario tenemos diferentes plantas medicinales, en particular también plantas endémicas propias de este territorio de Muequetá, de Bacatá, Bogotá, plantas que han permitido la vida, la medicina, la salud. Tenemos, por ejemplo, bastante.
Can you read the subtitles?
Aquí en el Cerro Santuario tenemos diferentes plantas medicinales, en particular también plantas endémicas propias de este territorio de Muequetá, de Bacatá, Bogotá, plantas que han permitido la vida, la medicina, la salud. Tenemos, por ejemplo, bastantes especies de tuno, tenemos también brugmáceas, lo que se llama en lengua muisca teque, ese teque que se utiliza para diferentes procedimientos rituales que permiten la armonía y la palabra. Tenemos el tabaco, con el cual se hacen consultas, pagamentos, y sirven para diferentes enfermedades. La sanación de esa planta es principalmente para temas espirituales, daños y afectaciones de esa índole. Tenemos aquí también diferentes arbustos, como la mora, como el tuno, como la mano de oso. Tenemos también plantas como de subpáramo, que nos permiten aquí la recolección y al recoger las aguas que hay en los caminos del agua de arriba, en las nubes, o cuando llueve las absorbe y las canaliza y salen aquí en estos espacios donde hay ojos de agua. Tenemos árboles muy importantes como el nogal, el cedro, que son sagrados para el pueblo muisca. tenemos arbustos, como lo es el aliso, como lo es la mata de monte, la madre monte, que ayuda a dar alimento a las aves nativas que andan aquí, como el comprapán, que está en peligro de extinción. Tenemos también el cucarachero de pantano, que está en peligro de extinción por la contaminación y la urbanización del territorio ancestral, donde ellas han pervivido y vivido durante siglos, años, milenios, como también lo hemos hecho nosotros, muiscas de Suba. Y tenemos aquí también especies como el búho, la lechuza. Tenemos también la pava andina, que va en migración desde el sur al norte, que se alimentan de plantas que hay aquí, de la curúa, de la uchúa, que son plantas nativas que aquí abundan. Tenemos también diferentes huertas que tienen maíz, haba, eh, papa, cilantro, acelga, caléndula, ruda, que son plantas medicinales y también de alimento que los siembran nuestros mayores, nuestros viejos, que pues andan enfermos en la ciudad y se vienen para aquí, para la montaña, a sembrar, a coger la tierra, a desconectarse de ese mundo capitalista que nos ofrece una forma de consumo permanentemente. Tenemos también aquí muchas plantas que permiten la medicina ancestral, como lo es el tabaco, como lo es el tijiquí, como lo es la ruda, como lo es el romero, como lo es la caléndula, como lo es el cidrón, como lo es el papayuelo, como lo es también el aliso y otras plantas también ya que son frutales, como la granadilla, el tomate de árbol. Y bueno, también aquí se tratan semilleros de hoja de coca para el tratamiento de las enfermedades internas del cuerpo, o la marihuana, que nos ayuda para las pomadas y los diferentes ungüentos para el cuerpo, que lo hacen los médicos y las parteras que hacen parte de la comunidad muisca. Entonces pues el santuario es un punto importante, vital para la salud, para la medicina, para el bienestar, para nuestros mayores, para nuestros jóvenes. En medio de la ciudad es un espacio autónomo que permite ser libre, estar en seguridad, que nos permite una autonomía como pueblo y particularmente la seguridad, entendiendo que la ciudad pues ofrece también esas formas de quitarle a la gente, de robar, de atracar, de hacerle daño. Pues esta zona es un espacio libre de esa inseguridad. Aquí se puede transitar y no hay peligro, no hay desconfianza y si hay peligro y miedo, pues es a los espíritus que lo habitan, porque ellos sí nos siguen y están ahí pendientes de nosotros en el qué hacer, en el qué decir. Eso es un poco de lo que es el santuario, un sitio sagrado vital para el pueblo muisca, y estamos ayudándonos con los animales y con las plantas a defenderlo. Eso es lo que estamos haciendo y pues es lo que buscamos de manera articulada con los que nos quieran colaborar, nos quieran ayudar, cualquier cosa. Aquí hacemos precisamente avistamiento astronómico, hacemos también procesos de sanación de la salud mental y procesos de medicina con la escucha y la palabra de nuestros mayores.
Okay, so we are gonna finish now, but this is under the threat of urban development. And currently the community doesn't even have a title to a small place for their council, their indigenous council. So one of the things that if in some way you are interested in how can I contribute in some way to this community, how I can collaborate, well, we have created GoFundMe. They were not aware of this, but I told them that this was a possibility. So if anybody is interested, just reach out to me or take a picture of the QR code. And well, just thank you so much to Nicole and Camila for being here and such an effort. And thank you for listening and having an open heart today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no toca Osiris González, no yolo pacpaqui, pampa inin tonali, nihuel tlato, y pan teonanacatl, and also Agmo pacpaqui, y pampa nico colistli. Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Osiris González. I am really glad because today I will be able to talk about sacred mushrooms or Tonanacatl. On the other hand, I am a little bit sad because I have some minor sickness, so I am not able to be with you in person. Anyway, I will share with you some of the outputs of the project Indigenous Medicine and Psilocybin Mushroom Rituals in Mesoamerica. This is the project that I am currently running out at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Thank you very much for your time. So let's move forward. Well, first of all, the project tends to fill a gap in knowledge, right? According to the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board Rapid Evidence Review, the authors acknowledge the limitation of the Western research model and how it might inequitably stratify evidence. In other words, evidence inequity. This rapid review excludes meaningful experience, knowledge, and wisdom from indigenous peoples and other communities and institutions not represented in the scientific literature. So this project aims to contribute to fill this gap in knowledge and overcome this evidence inequity with a professional research monograph on indigenous medicine and psilocybin mushroom rituals. Why is it important to study the Mesoamerican case? Well, because Mexico represents, without a doubt, the world's richest area in diversity and use of hallucinogens in Aboriginal societies, according to Schultz and Hoffman. It is a region with 10% of the world's total biodiversity, and Mexico is the region with the most significant amount of psychoactive biodiversity and mushroom psilocybin species, 55 according to the Index Fungorum. Moreover, grounded on archaeological evidence, ritual and therapeutic uses of plants and psilocybin mushrooms start at least 3 millennia ago. In the case of peyote, perhaps more. Also, this fellowship has been a great opportunity to carry out archive work in the Tina and Robert Gordon Wasson collections. The applicant identified already some materials which are priorities for the project. So this is the table of contents of the project. Of course, this will be a monograph of 8 chapters. And of course, for example, for me, it's a challenge because my previous research was focused on Nahua, mainly on Nahua philosophy, on Nahua communities. So, for example, in this project, we'll be addressing 4 different indigenous worldviews, indigenous cultures, different approaches to psilocybin mushroom rituals in Mesoamerica. So it's a project on comparative religions. So it's a challenge because it involves different communities, different languages, different geographical places. So this is the outline. And also I want to highlight, for example, the role of indigenous researchers because the development of collaborative research methodologies. Every chapter will be reviewed by a group of indigenous scholars. For example, the chapter 1 will be reviewed by indigenous archaeologists, Maya and Mixtec, Igliachel Cochti, currently assistant professor at the University of Texas, Austin, and Omar Aguilar Sanchez, currently a professor at the Universidad Comunal Autónoma de Oaxaca. Nowadays, I finished 6 of these 8 chapters. I just skipped the chapter 2, and I need to finish the chapter 8 because one of the main goals of this project was to highlight, for example, the Zapotec and the Ayuk cultures, because the Zapotec and Ayuk peoples tends to be overlooked in previous research. The vast majority of previous research has been focused on Maria Sabina and the Mazatec people, but very few studies deal with Zapotecs and with the Ayuk people or Mijes. One interesting highlight is that the Ayuk people has never been conquered. right, by military arms, and they used to name themselves as they never conquer it, right? So it's an interesting culture. So due to this, I decide, for example, to put more emphasis in these overlooked indigenous ontologies. So this is the table of contents. Nowadays, there are almost 50,000 words. So it's necessary, for example, to grapple. Also, this fellowship has been a great opportunity to work with the Tina and Robert Gordon Wasson collections with different species of psilocybin mushrooms. It's in Harvard Herbaria. And here we have two pictures from the collections, the Psilocybe cerulensis and Psilocybe mexicana. These are the two maps in the left side, right, with red dots are the community in which nowadays these healing rituals are performed, right? Very close to Mexico City in the region of the volcanoes. I have been working with Nahua communities precisely in Puebla and Tlaxcala. You will see the pictures later. And this project, I collaborate with Zapotec communities here in the Pacific Coast, but also in the center with some Zapotec philosophers. And during the summer, for example, I will be doing, for example, collaborative work and field work in the Mazatec communities, right? Mainly with 2 or 3 community-based organizations. So in the left side, we have the places, right? The regions where the psilocybin mushroom rituals are alive with red, and with green, there are communities in which these healing rituals have been recorded. But for example, there have not been updated or corroborated by anthropological studies in the last 20 years. On the right side, there is a map of the different species, right, of psilocybin mushrooms used in different regions and for different indigenous peoples. I previously mentioned that nowadays in Mexico, for example, there are growing 55 species of psilocybe mushrooms, right? Used traditionally by 11 indigenous peoples. Only in Oaxaca, Oaxaca is the region of the world in which grows the largest amount of psilocybin mushrooms, 27 species. And for these 27 species, 11 or 12 have been used by the indigenous peoples of Oaxaca. Indigenous methodologies. Previous to start this project, I have been collaborated with Eloy Garcia. He has a master in linguistics, and also he collaborates in order to settle the orthography, right? The norm for Mazatec language. We organized this virtual workshop on worldview and Mazatec language, free for everyone. This was in July, 1 month before start this project at Harvard University. And also, for example, we have been collaborated with Eloy from several times, not only with Eloy, but also with several indigenous scholars and in different projects. For example, here we have a brief overview of the main deities, right? In the Mazatec ontology, in the Mazatec worldview, some good ones, other evil one, right? And on the left, on the left side, for example, this is a special dossier on madness sickened and suffering on indigenous peoples. And it's a special dossier in which several indigenous scholars, mainly Mazatecs, collaborate in the specific topic of indigenous medicine. Not only Eloy, but also Heriberto Prado Pereda. He's a Mazatec activist. He was a priest, a Catholic priest, right? But nowadays he left, the Catholic Church, and now to become a cultural activist. He developed a wonderful work with the pastoral of Huautla, regarding, for example, the Mazatec rituals. But, however, okay, some of the most important topics, for example, it's the comparison of the different cultural uses of entheogens, sacred plants, or psychedelics for different purposes. So here we have a summary, for example, of the different uses of psychedelics by Western biomedicine. For example, there is according to the United Nations World Drug Report, psychedelics have been used in order to deal with depression, bipolar anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorder, cluster headaches, migraine, Alzheimer's, Parkinson, and so on. On the other hand, indigenous medicine, entheogens or power plants have been used for diagnosis, loss of the soul or shadow, shock or fright, bad air, evil eye, divination, madness, sorcery, witchcraft, transgression of moral orders, imbalance in the relationship with divinities, natural beings, and the dead or the ancestors. So, for example, this is the outline of the last chapter. I will perform a comparative study of Western biomedicine and indigenous medicine in order, to open the scope of these different approaches. And also, for example, here we have another reference of a paper written by Eloy. Why do you become math? Conceptions of the grandfather and grandmother, and Mazatec grandfathers and grandmothers of the community of Rio Santiago Huautla. Don't forget that this is the community in which Maria Sabina was born, right? So this is a very important framework and conceptual contribution of this project. Of course, previous to start the research, I made some fieldwork in some communities, San Mateo Redondo in Oaxaca, Zapotec and Mixtec. They used to organize a festival. Nowadays, for example, they include explicitly the topic of sacred and psilocybin mushrooms. They used to organize several cultural activities, exhibition, conference, workshops, and so on. And I have been invited several times, 2 or 3 times. And also I am advisor of the organizing committee of this festival. We tend to organize different roundtables or workshops, different activities. And this is one that we organized in the last edition, a roundtable on intercultural dialogue, respect, and traditional knowledge, close to the safety use of sacred mushrooms. René Alvarado is a Mazatec artist that belongs to the Casa Adobe Galeria. Eros Quintero is a biologist that belongs to Via Synapsis, another mestizo community. And Citlali Rodriguez also, she is the academic director of Casa Adobe Galeria. She wrote a wonderful book on the ritual uses of psilocybin mushrooms in the Sierra Mazateca. Unfortunately, there is no English translation, but the Spanish version is for free. I also, I delivered a talk, a conference. Well, the last one was a roundtable. This is a conference, History and Archaeology of Psilocybin Mushrooms, a ritual in Mesoamerica. I delivered this talk within the community in the same festival. And when I start this fellowship at Harvard University, of course, it was a great opportunity to perform archive work in Harvard Herbaria, in the Tina and Robert Gordon Wasson collection. Here I have some records as an historian also. I am a philosopher, but I also love history. So there is some examples of the material. The goal of this archive work is to find more material regarding Ayuk and Zapotec peoples, which are unrepresented in previous studies. This material are of special significance for chapters 6 and 7. This material includes photographs, fieldwork notes, inquisitorial archives, letters, slides of 35 millimeters. So here we have an example of an inquisitorial trial of 1630 that involves peyote and anacatl. Only a fragment was published by Robert Gordon Wasson in his book, but fortunately in the archive, I was able to find the whole document. There is a 10-page document, and now I am in the process to integrate all this information. Regarding the Mije or the Ayuk people, for example, on the right side, we have a photograph, a picture of 1954 in San Juan, Mazatlan, which is the region studied by the scholars in front of the curato, right, in front of the priest house in that community. And on the left side, we have this wonderful research, Time, Cosmos, and Religion from Ayuk People, written by Juan Carlos Reyes Gomez, an Ayuk linguist also, which nowadays is the rector of the University of Indigenous Language in Mexico. I was his teaching assistant at Leiden University. And also in the first page, for example, of this PhD dissertation, Juan Carlos developed a critical reflection regarding the use of the term indigena or indigenous, right? I will not go in further in this issue, but if you want to explore the arguments, you can download the thesis, okay? This is one of the examples of the boxes, and I spent several months, reading and looking for different information. And also, for example, regarding the Zapotecs, I found some interesting information in order to highlight the name of the ritual specialist. For example, in that case, Aristeo Macías, in this case, Aristeo Macías, a Zapotec healer from San Agustin Losicha. This photo was taken in July 2022 of 1925. And also on the right side, this is a picture of divine mushrooms, known in Spanish as Piule de Barda or El Grandote, also come from San Agustin Losicha. And I want to highlight, for example, the Zapotec culture, because the Zapotec culture is one of the ancient cultures. For example, Monte Albán, the main city in Oaxaca, for example, the ancient archaeological records come from 500 before Christ, the same time of the classic Athens. But the Zapotec, the Monte Albán city, for example, last 1,000 years or more, right? It's an ancient civilization, one of the ancients, and for strange reason, has been overlooked. So my goal is to highlight the knowledge of the Zapotec people. Also, the most well-known Maria Sabina, I only want to highlight a fragment. This is a biopsy of the monograph regarding some specific issues, right, on medicine and religious and spirituality. I don't ask for powers from the lords of the mountain. I am not a curer because I do not give potions or strange herbs to drink. I cure with language, nothing else. I am a wise woman, nothing else. I take little one who springs forth, the sacred mushrooms, and I see God. I see him sprout from the earth. He grows and grows. He has a tree, some mountain. His face is placid, beautiful, serene as in the temples. At other times, God is not like a man. He is the book, a book that is born from the earth, a sacred book whose birth makes the world shake. It is the book of God that speaks to me in order for me to speak. It counsels me. It teaches me. It tells me what I have to say to men, to the sick, to lie. The book appears and I learn new words. The mushrooms give me the power of universal contemplation, and I can see from the region, I can arrive where the world is born. This is only one example, one sample of a wonderful contributions and knowledge of different ritual specialists, not only Maria Sabina. I also want to highlight. Also, I have been working with Nahua communities previously. These are the communities very close to the volcano region in Puebla and Tlaxcala. there are some in the right side, some communal assemblies, in which I have been invited to collaborate. And on the left side, it was the first meeting of Nahuatl speaker of the region of the Malintzin in Tlaxcala in 2018, right? Some outputs of this previous work, for example, are here. This paper entitled Inclusive Research Methodologies and Community Efforts in Nahuatl Language Revitalization. So I am not only work on psychedelics, but also, for example, I am familiar with the revitalization of Nahuatl language, cultural heritage, and of course, sacred plants. The ritual specialists within Nahua community are very well known as Teciutlasque or Tiemperos, right? Or weather workers, and can be considered as heroes of the Teciutlasque, the ones who throw the hail, and Ahuaque, the owners of water. And they used to perform rituals at the top of the mountains and the volcanoes. Precisely, for example, this ritual took place 1 week ago during May 3, exactly, the last weekend, because the last weekend start the rainy season, right? So I am eager to travel to Mexico for the rainy season as soon as possible. The mushrooms are used to know about the sickness. Mushrooms are only used in special cases, like for a sickness that the community cannot resolve. Graniceros are given mushrooms to cure them. So this is one output, right, of this previous collaborative research, the healing of the thunderbolt and now entheogenic medicine, and it will be the chapter 4 for the monograph, but fortunately, for example, it will be published in the handbook of entheogenic healing in a couple of months. It was a collaboration with the PhD Maria del Carmen Macuil Garcia, and scholar with indigenous language, with indigenous heritage, and of course, a friend of mine since 20 years or something. Also, I have been working with indigenous philosophers, and in these collaborative community efforts, for example, we developed the permanent seminar on ancestral philosophy. They decide to avoid, for example, the term indigenous. If you are willing, for example, there in the YouTube channel, there are 15 different conferences, right? Every other Thursday, an indigenous scholar, an indigenous philosopher, for example, used to present. Why is important to recognize indigenous philosophies? Well, according to Philip Powys White, a Potawatomi philosopher, professor at the University of Michigan in the States, for example, in the United States, according to Philip Powys White, there are no more than 20 indigenous scholars with PhDs in philosophy, right? So our efforts, for example, is to work together to overcome this epistemic injustice, right? So in Mexico, we are working with indigenous philosophers, and for example, Dr. Juan Carlos Sánchez Antonio, PhD, is one of the most well Zapotec philosophers, and of course, we will be collaborating. For example, he's very kind, and he will be reading, for example, the chapter on Zapotec philosophy. Also, returning to Eloy, right? Eloy present, for example, a talk in the seminar on indigenous philosophies also regarding the guardians of the Mazatec, cosmogonic Mazatec world. And also, for example, they developed some critical thinking regarding some terms that have been used in the academia, right? And for example, he suggests that instead to use dialect, we have to use language or idioms, right? Instead of ethnic or group ethnics or indigenous or indigenous, native peoples, pueblos originarios, right? Communitary medicine, instead use empirical knowledge, right? Communitary knowledge, no underworld, but pure world, not shaman or witchcraft, instead wise men or people of knowledge, right? So there are some different approaches that these indigenous scholars have been developed. I am only sharing with you to let you know that I have been contested because they will be my readers if I decide to use a conventional framework, right? So finally, there are the two last slides. For example, the collaboration with Casa Adobe Galeria started several years ago. We used to organize different academic events, promote academic freedom of thought, right? And for example, we used to work together. For example, here you can see the work of René Alvarado, one of the members of Casa Adobe Galeria, but also other Mazatec scholars were involved, for example, in the program and in the organization of these events. And fortunately, in the summer, in a couple of months, we will be, developing some collaborative work, some interviews over there. So to conclude with this presentation, do you remember Elias? Elias, the director of Casa Adobe Galeria, visit Harvard at the beginning of the year. And I want to highlight, for example, this conclusion: make community work to save the world. And on the right side, for example, it's Elias teaching in one session in the course Psychedelic and Religion, indigenous traditions of the Americas. So we learn a lot from the Elias insights. So thank you very much. And a spoiler of what next, of course, it's a genealogy of the spirit. One of the outputs of this research will be, the study of the different words for spirit in the indigenous languages included in this research. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul and Jeff, for the invitation to join in this conversation. Gracias, Osiris. I hope you feel better soon. Y Andrea, Nicole y Camila, muchas gracias por todo. Gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. We're so thankful. Like I said, Latin American time, let's go. All right, so I will briefly just say that I'm joining this conversation as an outsider, not only to the field of psychedelics, but also to Latin American indigeneity. I'm a Chicana, Mexican-American from a mixed family. My father and his family were migrant farm workers who harvested crops in Texas and Colorado, where I was raised. And my mother's family were white ranchers and settlers from Northern European descent. So I focus my work in Mesoamerican and indigenous studies because of the various ruptures that exist as a result of colonization between me and my ancestors. I'm not indigenous, but I am committed to indigenous knowledge, to decolonization, land back, liberation, and good relations with our human, plant, animal, and more than human kin. I have the honor of learning among Native communities here in the US, and as well as incredible scholars and colleagues from Mexico, the Caribbean, Latin America in general. And like Osiris, I've also been doing some work with Nahua collaborators, but I'm interested in the diaspora and descendants and how we think from different places and relationships, how traditions, knowledge, and materials move. So despite this outsider position, I'm really grateful to humbly share some reflections to respond to these presentations. And what I'll say briefly might be new for some of us, might be old news, and if nothing else, it's a reminder for myself in this work. So as a student of religion in particular, I've witnessed the various trends towards indigenous religious traditions. And I think we must continue to advocate for this within our institutions. However, Elizabeth Cook Lynn, who's of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe, famously asked in 1997 who stole Native studies. She was rightly worried about how indigenous people become tokens and symbols, and I agree with her that indigenous scholars must emphasize epistemologies and sovereignty rather than trying to fit in to the existing frameworks. And it's true today, as it was then, that Indigenous and other minoritized communities are exhausted by extra administrative duties and relational labor that we do beyond what's expected. So not only do we face this colonialism as historical trauma, but also as an ongoing struggle and a structure and reality in which we often have to educate people around us. Therefore, to participate in these academic institutions, we're pulled away from our lands, our people, and we're asked to represent places where we come from while feeling disconnected. So Native American, Indigenous studies, and these kinds of conversations allow us to center the heart of the matter, where colonization will not be overlooked, and the particularity, cultural specificity, and protocols are prioritized. So I'm beginning with this to honor the contributions of our colleagues as they navigate these complicated contexts. And I'll emphasize that while we look for areas of overlap and commonality across these different traditions, we also avoid all the easy answers that come with packaging up vast diversity of Native people into a monolith. There's no one way to be Indigenous. We also avoid tropes which position indigeneity as static, primarily in the past, or especially romanticization of an ecological Indigenous person. We have a great example of the urban context over here. And then finally, we'll avoid the good, bad Indian framing, especially when Indigenous communities are resisting or practicing refusal. They have the right to opacity, as Edouard Glissant said. So ultimately, while we have to respect that not all knowledge is for all people. Not all experiences are ours for the taking. And Brian Burkhart, one of the Indigenous philosophers here in the US, says that epistemologies are tied to place. And so in institutions where we collect a lot of things, a lot of knowledge, and try to grasp the world's religions and materials, we remind ourselves to look to our elders, tribal leaders, knowledge keepers, and community members to determine if and how to collaborate and support their projects. We saw some really beautiful examples, such as beginning and ending with the sacred mountain, where we see the importance of territory, the importance of being in a place that is one's own, that is safe. We saw that medicine can be more than psychotropic, and so that there's a sacred relationship with many plants, some of which are thought of as common or that we might overlook in our day-to-day lives. Nicole also pointed out that buckets from waste can be used for botanical memory. So cool, love that grandmothers are doing that. And Camilla reminded us that there are acts of resistance in saying that we are still here and that we continue to flourish. And that ultimately, as they emphasize, that this is not about or without Indigenous peoples. And Osiris, I really was interested in these archives that you're looking at here at Harvard. You brought our attention to one of the ways in which colonization is still active in the actual ownership of the materials, the photos, the words of Indigenous peoples. So I'm curious about how you're thinking about these archives. How do you both represent Mesoamerica and bring this Indigenous knowledge into conversation with what we might call the mainstream? But also, how do we want to bring that home? So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about intellectual sovereignty and renaming these archives, or what kind of actions Harvard might take to make those materials available. And then I'm interested in all of you thinking a little bit with us about who are you talking to and why? What kind of intervention would you like to see in these places where we're talking about sacred plant medicines? Osiris, as I mentioned, you are bringing Mesoamerican studies into a conversation where we're taking seriously the deep past and also the present. And also, what kind of benefits might the community see in that knowledge coming into the larger conversation of sacred medicine? And of course, I'm thinking about our mutual contact, Yuria Celedwen's work on ethical guidelines and benefit sharing, which is really specific, practical ways that things can move forward. And then Andrea and colleagues, I think the urban context is so important. And one big question I have, which you can see in some of my own biography, is what happens with movement and migration? Being in Bogotá, your community has stayed in the same place, but the lands have changed around you. And so how do you expect the community to engage with these plants and these rituals? What is the role of mestizaje, or people who are in Bogotá but are not connected with their Indigenous roots? And what does it mean that these caminantes de la medicina, I think it was, that these ritual specialists, that they are, that they're integrating other plants as well. So if you could tell us a little bit about those things, I'll end there, but thank you all so much for your contributions.
Oh, go ahead, Osiris.
Who?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Osiris.
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
want to
sure.
take 5 minutes
Yeah,
or so
yeah,
to
yeah.
respond.
Yeah, yeah. I can answer, for example, the question regarding the archives, the information that, it's an issue. It's not an issue, not only regarding the collections at Harvard, but the British Museum, the National Museum of Anthropology, and so on. So it's necessary, for example, to start a dialogue, right? A cross-cultural dialogue. Nowadays, for example, in museum studies, there is very well known to talk about repatriation. And repatriation has pros and cons. But for example, one of the cons is that repatriation is mainly focused on the objects, the fetishism of the objects. So in order to overcome these fetishes of the objects, for example, one suggestion is, for example, the democratization of knowledge, right? The accessibility, right? I noticed, for example, when you are at Harvard University, you have a privileged access to different resources, libraries, archives, collections, and so on. So, okay, as a researcher, is good, but how to encourage, this democratization of knowledge for everyone, for indigenous communities, for indigenous scholars, right? So, for example, I guess that it would be interesting to develop some um, academic programs grounded in reciprocity in order to put the focus in the knowledge, how the knowledge is gathering, produced, and sharing. And also, for example, the inclusion of more indigenous scholars, for example, will be a good signal that this will be evolving during time. So I don't know if with this is enough, or for example, I can move forward with the next question, Rebecca.
That's great. Yeah, if you want to go to the next question, and just I want to be mindful of the AV team here. So Osiris, if you want to take another 2 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Andrea to respond, and also we want to have time for the closing ceremony.
Yes, sure. And in that case, for example, it's a topic regarding with cultural heritage. For example, indigenous medicines and psilocybin mushroom rituals. Of course, for example, one alternative is follow the path that in Peru, when they recognize, for example, the ayahuasca as a part of the cultural heritage, but perhaps it's not enough, right? It's necessary, for example, to ensure the development of public policies capable, for example, to guarantee the rights of indigenous peoples, tried, for example, to achieve a more equitable and fair share of benefits, and also, for example, develop inclusive research methodologies. Finally, for example, the inclusion, or not the inclusion, but the development of indigenous languages it's very important. For example, beside this project on indigenous medicine and psilocybin mushroom rituals in Mesoamerica, I have been developing educational materials on history of the sacred plants. And for example, one of the goals is that this website, for example, will be in English, in Spanish, but also in Mazatec, and also, for example, in Nahuatl. Why? Because in the future, there will be educational resources for future generations. For example, the Summer Institute of Linguistics have been translated the Bible in different indigenous languages. You can read the Bible, for example, in 6 or 7 different variants of the Nahuatl language. But unfortunately, other educational materials are not available. So it will be great, for example, to share some educational materials produced and support and backed by Harvard University in indigenous languages, for example, regarding this sacred plant. And this will be very useful, for example, to avoid the stigma and to encourage, especially the young generations, to be interested in these topics in order, for example, to overcome the disconnection. To conclude, for example, my intervention, I want to highlight that there is a disconnection, right? An alienation, a disconnection between cultural heritage and indigenous communities. At least, for example, in some cases in Mexico, unfortunately, for example, the indigenous communities are not aware where is their cultural heritage, the sculptures, the codex, and so on. We have some examples, right? With Raúl Macquil, an our historian, we rename a codex that is nowadays at the British Museum. Codex Oban we rename as Xupowali of Tenochtitlan. And when we present, for example, our results in the communities, some people was aware, right, of our collaborative research, and they noticed, for example, or they realized, for example, that with this document they have enough elements to argue that their community, for example, start during the pre-colonial times. So it's important, for example, to work to overcome the disconnection of the cultural heritage with contemporary indigenous communities, and also with the worldwide, with the general audience, and also with non-indigenous populations.
So she's actually interested in what are my answers for these questions. And so she can later say that I'm wrong. No. So you asked several questions for the sake of the time. So I'm gonna pick. She told me to pick some, and something that I found interesting when I started my work was that interaction between the citizens from Bogotá that are not native to, that are not native from Bogotá, they're not indigenous. So to have more of the background, there is a strong stigma still in the city on how you have this identity as an indigenous person. So in the case of Bogotá, and at least in my experience in public settings where different rituals were taking place, there's still this gaze from the non-indigenous that is not the best gaze that they have. And also they're portraying them, some of them as witches and potheads. That was the first time that I was, the first time I was doing fieldwork, there were some of people telling them, oh, ustedes son marihuaneros todos. Like, you all are potheads. So there's a strong stigma of what it means to be indigenous in the cities because, it's still the idea of the city as a white place still is very strong in the mind. And also because this process of revitalization is a young process. It started in the 90s, even though it started centuries ago and decades ago when the families start reaffirming their identities. It was only recognized in the 90s, but in reality, citizens from Bogotá, some of them, they don't even know that the Muysca people are still in the city, because in the textbooks, all of the textbooks for public schools, they say the Muyscas were extinct, and also the language was extinct, but it's very alive. And even as a I'm from Bogotá, I grew up in Suba, and I say in my everyday many Muysquismos. So language is part of my everyday, even though I'm not Muysca. And the integration of different plants of other territories. So from the interviews that with some of the Shaitas, they refer that the more than the medicine being from other communities, so they don't own the medicine. It's not like the Muysca medicine in the sense of, or the Inga medicine is not so much about the community, but it's a medicine that emerges from the land, and the land is generous enough to share with other communities, as long as the elders agree with this in exchange with other communities. And so that has been my experience. I hope I didn't.
No, it's okay. And I think this is the best way in which I can answer you, because around the interaction between us as original people with others like Andrea is this exercise, the fact that we can listen others and listen our voices. That Andrea said are usually different voices. So in this case, the interaction has been something really difficult. Of course, a lot of people arrive to our territory, but I thought that has a lot of problems that we mentioned in the presentation, like the urbanization, the contamination, things like that, has been also that interaction, the way in which we are trying to resist in today. That's why, because, for example, I'm speaking English in this moment, or trying, because when we discover that the other also has something that can be useful for us, that's the intention that we have as community. Try to do intercultural dialogues in which I can learn how to defend my territory if I know about laws, for example. So with plants has been that. A lot of plants arrive to our territory, for example, the eucalypto. So that's a plant that was arrived to Europe, from Europe, I'm sorry, and the principal reason was for dry the land, because our land is full of water. So that was a plant that the purpose was kind of bad. But today, we are trying to use it for breath illnesses, or respiratory, exactly. So we are trying to discovering these dialogues, the way in which we can defend us, and preparing us to change the mind of people around the land. So, for example, these consciousness of the land is only a city is something that is changing with these kind of researchers. So today, people start to see in Bogotá as an indigenous land, and this is an invitation, for example, to you in this land too, because we see a city, but it's also a sacred land. So that has been the interaction between the other and us. Of course, with a lot of struggle, we have to struggle a lot, but we're trying to change the mind about it. Try to see that the difference has been an advantage and no something bad. Yeah, I'm sorry because my English.
I'm so sorry that we have to conclude, but we're well over time. So please join me in thanking Osiris, Andrea, Rebecca, and also Camila and Nicole. It's such a privilege to welcome you here. So before we conclude the evening, let me just remind you, I believe there will be a closing, we'll just call it that. It's not a ceremony, closing non-ceremony. Out in the lawn, you're all welcome to join us. So please join me in thanking our speakers.
CSWR.HDS.Harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.